Welcome to the 2015 Mabelle and Mike Hardy Fire Science Lecture here at the University of Montana. This is a tremendous opportunity for us this year because we get to celebrate not only a specific topic but the career of our beloved professor, Dr. Ron Wakimoto. Ron is going to be our featured speaker today, but I want to introduce the benefactor of this series because this is an annual event where we talk about key issues in fire science and management. And I'd like to bring up to the podium the program leader for the fire science program for the Rocky Mountain Station, and someone who's a long-term friend of the college, a member of our advisory committee, and the son of Mabelle and Mark, who made this gift and this event possible, Dr. Colin Hardy.
Well, later in my career, I get asked to do some pretty cool things, but this is really special for me, Jim. So thanks a lot. I told Jim a story earlier, and he said I need to share this. My first science presentation in my entire life as a master's student was in 1983 at the Northwest Scientific Association meeting in Olympia, Washington. And sitting near the back was the University of Montana's then fairly new professor of fire science, Ron Wakimoto. And he caught my eye and gave me his characteristic nod. Said, "You're doing all right, buddy, keep going at it." And I can still picture him in the back of that auditorium offering that. And then afterwards he came up and introduced himself, and I really realized how special he was. And now, what is it, 32 years later, Ron's been my mentor. I've been a student of his. He was on my PhD committee, which was just 10 years ago, despite the gray hair. But most important of anything, I think, is he was a very good friend of my mom and dad, Mike and Mabelle Hardy. And I know that they are very honored to be your sponsor today for this, Ron. So congratulations. Thank you.
Well, we have this outstanding presentation, and I won't get in the way of it any longer. Ron Wakimoto has been our fire scientist on the faculty for 34 years. He came in 1981. They didn't start paying him until 82. Like Ron, he kind of works for free a lot. I've got to say one thing, Ron, that has impressed me throughout my 20 years here is that for every student event, it didn't make any difference if it was some tree planting or some rec program or some event for a graduate student or for the SAF, whatever it might be, you were always there. And for that dedication, I honor you and tell you that I don't know any faculty member who is more committed to the students. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome Ron to the stage for his presentation, 30 Years of Federal Forest Fire Management and Change. Ron, take it away. He'll have his prepared remarks, and then we'll have some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I hope everything's rolling here. I thought about it, and luckily I talked to Leanna just before we kind of got going today, and I just thought about how dry talking about fire policy for an hour would be. No matter how you cut it, you know what I mean? No matter how you cut it, or you put up the diagrams and all this stuff, and so that's why I chose not to. We kind of talk about some different things about fire policy. Before I do that, I guess I got some introduction of myself. It's kind of a different thing for me. I appreciate you all being here. You know, I grew up in California, in the Central Valley of California, in Stockton, and my dad ran a fish market, and I worked that fish market from the time I was 8, when I could stand on a Coke crate on its edge to look at the scale, until I was 18, and then went off to college, and then forestry camp and all those other kinds of things. And I'll just tell you, and I put it in my retirement letter to Jim, because I had to declare that kind of early. I said that in that letter that when I was growing up, my dad would close the entire fish market. He worked 7 days a week, so he and my mom would close the fish market up in the month of August. Because who wants to cook fish when it's 105 degrees in the shade, And And so we would scrub the counters out really well because you can imagine the bacteria would really grow quickly. And really clean it all out and then go fishing for fun someplace in the West. And the only place we ever went 2 years in a row was Ennis, Montana. And so when I announced that I was resigning at Berkeley and going to the University of Montana as a faculty member, my mom let out this huge moan because she figured I was either going to the end of the earth or to where you could see it from. Because you can imagine being out on a sagebrush flat at McAllister, Montana in 1962. Okay, quite a different place than it is now. I'm sure it's just massive condos and all the deal. But it was pretty bleak sagebrush flat in 1962, so that's why my mom had that feeling. In contrast, my dad, you know, I'm sure it affects a lot of the faculty members here, my dad just smiled. He never said a darn thing, but he just smiled and he said, you know, that darn guy figured a way to get paid to be there. Because he busted his butt to be able to go to Montana. So there's lots of people in this world that bust their butt to be able to go to Montana. All right. The topic I have here is 30 years of federal fire policy change, one professor's view. So you have to understand that I'm going to be talking about kind of different things and maybe not directly about policy itself in terms of the fire, but what I saw and what I observed as the outsider. You know, there would be meetings where I would be considered the Teflon boy because I didn't wear green underwear. Okay. Those in this audience that did wear green underwear realized that at times they just couldn't say what they really were thinking about what the issues were. So that's why it's a very different thing for me, and that's what you're going to hear today. I joined the Berkeley faculty in September of 1976.
Go Bears.
Yeah, Kathy Stewart down here cheering us on. And you have to realize in '76 we were still under the 10 a.m. policy. Okay? That is that all fires were to be, well, I think the original policy said suppressed by 10 a.m. on the day following the report of the fire. And when I first heard of the 10 a.m. policy as an undergraduate student, I figured there was a huge, much more descriptive, description of that policy. But what I just said was all it was. It was one sentence in 5100 in the Forest Service manual. Just that one sentence was that policy. And the Forest Service followed that policy from 1935 all the way till 1978. So, like I said, I joined the faculty in '76, so 10 a.m. was going. Now, as a new faculty member, I was kind of an odd egg because and I've related that to some of the faculty here with this more recent, the interviewing of the folks that are hopefully going to replace me and in that fire position. And that whole deal there is because I was one of those guys who went to school at Berkeley all those years. And then in one summer, I went on the other side of the table and I was a professor. So it was a very different kind of environment to be there and do that quickly. So, you know, when I was in grad school, for those who were in fire, you remember these names probably, some of you will. Jan van Wankendonk was one of my associates. He was a few years older. He's, you know, 101st Airborne in Vietnam, smoke jumper, Cave Junction. And he was in graduate school, and then he was the chief scientist at Yosemite National Park for quite a while. Then, of course, was forced to be USGS scientist, and outstanding scientist there. And on the other side, again, ahead of me was Jim Agee. There were three of us. We were the last of Biswell's PhDs. And Jim Agee, of course, wrote the book, you know, Fire Ecology of Pacific Northwest Forests. And those are the kind of guys I went to school with, so it was really a different environment there as well. You know, Harold Biswell, our major professor, was a research scientist for the Forest Service. I don't know if everybody knew that. until 1947, and he was hired to teach range management at Berkeley. And he began to, again, do fire research. You know, Running's over here smiling. You know, we hired him to be the dendrology professor, I think. So same kind of deal. You don't necessarily end up in that same place. So Doc began to do stuff with fire and to light forest fires, of all things. This is 1947. You have to understand the psyche of what was going on. And of course, because of the fact that he lit those fires and was challenging Forest Service policy every day in every publication he put out, because it was talking about the natural and historic role of fire and the response of the environment to that. And of all things, he even threw in Native Americans, Native people that were part of that whole scheme of fire in the forest. And those are things that Harold both believed and saw and witnessed and talked about and wrote about. And because he did that, it is a part of our fire policy to think about that. And of course, we were all graduate students at Harold. And you know, it's quite different when you go to a big meeting and they're calling your major professor Dr. Burnwell, you know, or Burning Busy, or of course the infamous Harry the Torch. Those were names that were commonly used to describe Harold Biswell whatever meetings you were at. So that really did motivate Harold's graduate students to be able to realize that what we had to do is do the science, follow his actions, follow his science, and take his examples of teaching and leading people and having them think about different things than just wearing green underwear. And of course, by the time I was finishing school, the academics had realized that. They were giving Harold national awards for his persistence and his ability to hang in there despite all those odds for all those years with all those names. And he eventually proved all those detractors wrong. You know, I have to say this, I joined that faculty in September of 1976. And of course, on November 9th, 1976, anybody know what happened then? Poor Smokey the Bear died in the National Zoo. I mean, he really did. I mean, we're talking about front page obituary in the Wall Street Journal. Okay, I mean, this is significant, right? That Smokey died in the National Zoo. And so, you know, I'm the radical young Berkeley professor. So the first thing I did is ordered some bumper stickers. And they said, "Smokey is dead. Prescribed forest fires." Where is, oh. I think Steve Arnold put that in his book, didn't you, Steve? Or something? Yeah, there he is, right there. Yeah, you guys are a wonderful crowd. Seeing different folks here that have so much meaning to my existence here. Well, anyway, I put that bumper sticker and it was on, you know, people were talking about it, and sure enough, this was my first introduction to national public radio, okay, NPR in the Bay Area. And of course, I'm an active supporter right now, like many of you are, in terms of our public radio station here in Missoula. And so they did a phone interview with me, and I listened to what they had to say, and they said, "Okay, you know, go ahead and talk about this stuff." So I started talking about this stuff, and they would ask me a really good question, and I'd give them another answer. And we went on for about a half an hour. And because this is sort of my first excursion for me in terms of this fire policy. You know, Doc was saying all this stuff, not me, and was catching all this flack. Now I'm kind of saying these things and kind of see how the road goes, you know. And, well, what happened is NPR cut every statement I made into one-liners. And then they were knowledgeable enough, and I felt, well, I realized how vulnerable I was, because they would actually ask a better question and then feed in my one-liner as if I was answering that question. Came out smelling like a rose. So I thought, oh, I'm doing pretty good. And then all of a sudden, I get this phone call. My cousin's husband at that time was the head pharmacist for the UC Med Center. And and they're filling prescriptions in the hospital and doing all this stuff. And they have National Public Radio on full blast, right? Well, they're filling their pills. And my cousin called me in my office. He said, "What the hell are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Oh, you're getting on Smokey the Bear, and you're almost causing a riot in my office." And that's because it was bringing out all those feelings. I mean, they were really angry that I was saying any of these things. I mean, they were. He really told me I had to cool it because he was concerned at what was going to happen in his office. And I guess at one time I contemplated leading us all in because of the age of the people here, you probably know some of those Smokey Bear songs, at least the choruses to those, but I'm not going to do it here.
Howling and growling and sniffing
In the air, he can find a fire before it starts to flame, right? That's why they call him Smokey. That is how he got it. All right, so. Every kid, knew those songs. I remember even in the fire management course I took at Berkeley, we actually saw this video, or I guess it's just a 16mm movie at that time, with Hopalong Cassidy. And the last line of with all the kids in the campground and the fire and all this stuff, the last line is Hopalong Cassidy sitting there with his big hat on, sitting on a log saying, "Partners, I hate forest fires more than all the diamondback rattlesnakes in the world." That's how the thing ended, so it socked it to him. Right? And so people have those memories, and that's what I was stirring up. I was kicking dirt on Smokey in his grave. Right? But that was the first time. I really sort of kind of challenged that policy. And I guess I'll got to think about how to do this here. Well, there were things that happened, and of course, everything in fire seems to happen in Missoula, Montana. I guess I'll say that. Whether whatever, the smoke jumpers, whatever. And way back in 1962, two brothers, Ed and Roy Comark, started the Tall Timbers Fire Ecology Conferences down in Tallahassee, Florida. And luckily, through Harold, I got to meet Ed Comark and his wife Betty at different parties in Berkeley. And fortunately, I think it's fortunately, I haven't talked to these Fire Lab folks about it, but in 1974, prior to that, you couldn't believe Forest Service literature in fire. I have to tell you that. It was actively manipulated because they all had to get approved for policy reasons in terms of that, in terms of their writing. And certainly by 1970 or so, they were still restricted. Well, in 1974, Ed Comark brought the Tall Timbers Fire Ecology Conference to Missoula, Montana. In fact, they held the conference here in this building. And it was, for me, as the outsider looking in, it seemed like it was almost the first time that you could publicly be someone who wore green underwear and publicly say the things that we take as commonplace about the role of fire and the fire ecology of the western United States. It's pretty remarkable to have that happen, but it happened here in Missoula, Montana. At that meeting, there were remarkable people, and many people here knew them. Gosh, we had Bob Sellers, and kind of forestalling what was going to come, we had Bob Sellers and Donda Spain on the program. We had, of course, Jim Lowden, Rod Norum, Pete Stickney, Jack Lyon, Nellie Stark, Dale Wade, Darrell Ward, my predecessor Bob Steele, Ray Shear, Bud Moore, they were all speakers at this conference. And you think about that in 1974, they could do it in Missoula, Montana because Ed Comark brought that conference here. So it's a wonderful event. They got the opportunity to share with the world what they were finding. You know, I came to this university in 1982. Jim was saying that I was here. Well, what happened is, they offered me the job in end of July. And Sandy and I couldn't move that quickly, and I really kind of had to do lots of stuff at Berkeley, so I stayed. And I came here in December, you know, with a little old pickup truck and 40 pounds of powder, 500 pounds of lead shot, canoe on the top. You know, it was this perfect deal. I thought about it later. If I'd been in a wreck, there would just been a black hole in the sky. But when I got here, it was quite interesting because in terms of fire policy, we had just revised that. You know, we had revised the fire policy in 1978. The Forest Service had accepted fires as the natural role of fire or the historic role of fire in the forest. And they said all those things. They were doing those kinds of things in wilderness where wilderness fires were allowed to burn. Kind of a strange thing, you know. Bob Mutch watched that very first fire way back in 1972, and that fire had to be approved by the Chief of the Forest Service just to be allowed to burn back then. You know, now regional foresters can do that stuff. But the policies were being exercised by various people. A lot of people were jumping online, making up fire management plans and allowing fires to burn. We had active programs in Yosemite and Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park, where they had huge prescribed burning programs, burning, you know, 10,000 acres in a season, in large blocks, and also allowing fires to burn. So they were exercising that 1978 policy and doing that very successfully. I was very familiar with those programs because I'd been to California. In fact, some of my students ended up working in those parks, working on prescription development and things like that. I was very fortunate, you know, thinking about all these changes in fire policy and seeing here in this region how readily fire managers embraced the changes of the 1978 fire policy. We had many fire management plans being actively written. And then, of course, for everybody, the big thing that happened, of course, was 1988. Okay, and the Yellowstone events that attracted a lot of attention and public controversy. In '88, I came, you know, here I was in Missoula, Montana as the faculty in fire, and I got all the policy questions I could handle in that 1 year. Sid Frizzell was the dean, and he almost, but not quite, decided to set up a hotline for me because all I did is answered questions all day from press and whatever, because phone just rang off the hook. Documentary filmmakers were trying to come out here, and I had made a conscious effort by then not to chase fire trucks. You know, that's in terms of my work. And what was interesting was I was very fortunate for all my friends from the fire lab because I suddenly got a call and they said, "Hey, Ron, you want to go to the park with us?" This was in the latter part of September, and I jumped in a Suburban, a Forest Service Suburban. You know, it's probably still kicking around, but because those were two-wheel drive Suburbans in those days, and I got in. They saved me a seat in the Suburban, and we took off. And as we rode down the road, I think it was probably Jack Lyon pulled out this letter. He said, "Hey, Ron, you should read this letter." And I looked at it, and it was from the Chief of the Forest Service. And I read it, and what it said was, hey, you know, he was just trying to rally the troops because things looked pretty bleak. And he said, look, what we really want to do, we have to work at putting out these fires. No question of that. But once that's done, we are going to have a national fire policy review. And that fire policy review has got to be up front because it's in front of the public. And we have to be able to do that fire policy review, just up front so that people can really see what's going on. And it described the committees. It described the committee as the head of all the federal agencies in fire, National Association of State Foresters. It described, National Association of State Foresters, which is a big, powerful lobby, if you don't know that, and Western States Governors Association. And then, of course, it said, and there will be two members from the academic community who will be on this fire policy review. And the first thing they said was, "Oh, Ron, you better throw your hat in the ring." And I thought about it a little bit. When we got back, they bugged me all the way during the whole trip, and I did. And surprisingly, within a week or so, it wasn't very long, I got a letter from the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Interior saying, "You are on this national committee. We want you to review fire policy." And so our first meeting was in Jackson, Wyoming, in late October of 1988. And I was, when I walked in the room, I kind of realized we had a problem. And part of it was that the heads of fire had never ever met each other. When you think about that, in those days, Foresters was a certain way, BLM was a certain way, same with those other agencies. And what was funny was that the scientists in the room had all worked together. Okay, Bruce Kilgore, who was the chief scientist for the national park in the western region, he'd been here in Missoula, Montana as the project leader for Wilderness Fire and had gone back. Okay, and an old friend, he was actually Dave Brower's assistant when he created the Sierra Club. So he'd been a long time in the Berkeley PhD. So he was there, and then of course the other academic, they had to pick two academics from that community. The other academic was Bob Lee, who was at that time the chairman of forestry at the University of Washington. And believe it or not, another Berkeley PhD. In fact, we'd gone to school together. And more importantly for us, when I came in the room, he laughed in my face. And we laughed about it because we both gone to school and got our PhDs at Berkeley. We somehow both were hired as professors at the University of California at Berkeley, 2 years apart. He was older than I was. And 2 years apart, we left the University of California. And here we were, the two that were picked to review national policy, and we meet in Jackson, Wyoming. Other things that, the big problem that hit us immediately, just so you know, is that, I think those who think about it, professors are kind of loose cannons. They want to shoot off their mouth and say what they're going to say, and they're not used to being constricted by any their academic freedom. And so why does running get prevented from speaking in Shoto High School, right? But so they were quite concerned, and so the first thing that happened is the Department of Interior, the Interior side cited FACA, okay, Federal Advisory Committee Act, and that says that if you have a committee and there's someone on there that's a non-Fed, that what you say can't become policy. Okay? And so they immediately cited FACA and said, hey, we don't want these guys in the room, especially not two professors, okay, who know each other, And what was funny, well, I guess I'd say, I don't know if it was funny. Yeah. But we were kind of concerned, but I guess I'll say out loud to you, Charlie Philpott, who represented the agriculture side and longtime fire scientist, kind of saved the day because he realized that in our hip pockets we had this letter from the Secretary of Agriculture saying you are on the committee. And he didn't want us to raise a big stink about that, so he just said, look, here's what we have to do. Because we can't have you on the committee because Interior objects, because we want this to be policy when we finish. So here's what we're going to do. The Forest Service will pay all your expenses, all the meetings. You come just like you're a member. You speak out. You say what you want to say. We're not going to control any of that, but you've got to participate in this just as if you're a member, but you don't have to sign it. Okay, and that's well, Bob Lee and I accepted that, but State Forester of North Carolina didn't accept that. Harry Lehman didn't accept that. Anyway, when I was talking about the problems for this meeting, when we walked in, there was a commotion going on in the hallway, and it was the public affairs officer from the Park Service out of the Denver Service Center physically throwing reporters out of the room. And he said, you don't have a right to be here, and they're citing all the other kind of laws that allow them to be there. And so, you know, they really didn't have a problem when this was all coming down on us. We got in the room, and finally what happened is that he talked them into saying that every time we took a break, you know, for lots of different reasons, every time we took a break there would be a press conference. And that sort of calmed them down enough so that those reporters stayed outside of the room. That's just the start. Okay? The next thing that happened is that same public affairs officer started passing out the 1976. Okay? This is 88. He's passing out the 1976 Yellowstone Fire Management Plan to all the committee members. And we're opening it up, and it has all the signatures of what the 5 supervisors of the adjacent national forests, and it had the Park Service Yellowstone Park Superintendent and the Grand Teton Park Superintendent, because they're all conjoining lands, and you could have fires move across borders, so you needed those kind of agreements. And it was all well signed, and we were looking at it. We're kind of scratching our head, because for those of you who know how we've changed our policy, not only did we change the policy in '78, but one of the things that we did is we adopted the National Fire Danger Rating System, which allowed us to do analysis of historic weather. So we knew when we were hung out or when we weren't. At least that's supposed to be the idea. And so here we had a '76 plan that had none of those things in it. It was devoid of those things. It was based on art and intuition. Now, there are lots of friends that told me, you know, if Bob Sellers had been running that plan, it would have all worked. And I don't know that it would have, but, you know, I had met Bob Sellers before, years before, in other fire meetings, but there were none of that. There was just the intuition and none of the decision trees that we have that expectation we'll find in a fire management plan today to allow fires to burn. And then it got worse, because the Yellowstone folks showed up and handed us, they said, oh, we didn't use that plan. We used this plan. And they handed us all the 1986 Fire Management Plan for Yellowstone. You know, pretty impressive document, except that none of the 4 supervisors of the 5 national forests had signed it. The superintendent of Grand Teton had not signed it. And the superintendent of Yellowstone, his name was forged by his assistant. That's the plan that we had. And for those, you know, who do different things, it's like managing a national forest with a forest plan that the regional forester didn't sign. Okay, that is not going to happen. And so the Forest Service side of things, they reacted that way. What are we looking at this plan for? It's not even a legal document that we should be following. And yet that's what we got, okay, in terms of that Yellowstone deal. The other thing we got was a letter from Walter Hickel. Hickel was the former governor of Alaska. He was also Secretary of Interior, right, under Nixon. And we got a letter from him saying, stay out of our stuff, okay? And those who are knowledgeable about fire, you realize that national fire policy didn't work in Alaska. They had worked out other ways. They had huge operational fire management zones, big fire management zones where they allowed fires to burn, and a very different program and policy, all as if they were wildfires, and that's how they were funded. And so he just said, stay away from our stuff. We don't want to be included in the discussion. Okay, so we made that very clear that we would exclude the discussion of Alaska. Now, what we found very quickly when we started to talk about our national policy, beyond all these things that I said, kind of make it a reasonable meeting. First of all, among the agencies, there were no reasonable or no accepted definitions that they agreed to. Okay, that was a big problem because we're supposed to be putting out a public document that says this is how we should change national policy, and yet there were no sets of definitions. I knew, because I taught here, I had a course where we reviewed fire management plans in this region, and there were sites where we had observational fire management plans, or fire management. It was called observational fire management. You know, we're going to watch it. We had operational fire management zones. I don't know what that was. We had different plans in the United States using the term unplanned ignitions. Those were primarily Park Service plans, believe it or not. And the Forest Service, because it was Park Service that said unplanned, they used unscheduled. Okay? I just want to say that because there was clearly competition, and clearly their minds didn't meet on any of these terms. My friend Tom Nicholas from the Park Service once pointed out to me that the term, you know, the infamous term, let burn, was often used to describe what was happening in Yellowstone. And that actually came from for those who are interested in that, that actually came from a map that was in a publication by Kilgore and Briggs. Briggs was his fire management officer. George Briggs was the fire management officer of Sequoia. And they never used the term in the paper, but they have this picture of a map, of a topographic map of Sequoia Park. And right across the top, it said, let burn. And that's how we ended up with that term as a national fire policy term. Interestingly enough, when we all got all the things out, they would agree, the committee agreed that we could use the term prescribed natural fire. That was the only term that they agreed upon, okay, in national policy. We had the term wildfire, but I don't know that they would have agreed on that. We never did talk about that particular term. Okay, so it was certainly not agreed to. We realized right away that there was no federal fire policy. There's no uniform federal fire policy. We had Forest Service 5100 in the manual. We had the Interior Manual, and that did not agree with NPS 18, which was the Park Service fire policy. So you can kind of see that we did have this big array of problems that we were trying to work through. The other thing that came up, and it was kind of interesting because the regional forester, Region 2, brought it up, and he said, you know, they want somebody's head on a stick, so we ought to give it to them. So what he did is he actually said that, you know, people want someone accountable for these actions. So all those members of that committee were agreed upon that we would put in this whole idea of a line officer, that the line officer was really responsible, which for most cases would be a forest supervisor or a park superintendent. If you really know what happened in Yellowstone, only poor Bill Mott, the director of the Park Service, lost his head in this whole thing. Okay. I guess I just digress a little bit. You know, for me and for Bob Lee, because we were both from Berkeley, it was like deja vu all over again. You know, I think that's the the Yogi Berra saying, deja vu all over again. And that's because when we were at school, Ronald Reagan was governor of the state of California. William Meese III was Attorney General of California. And Bill Mott was the director of the California State Parks. Okay? And here we were now dealing with fire policy in Yellowstone, and Ronald Reagan was the President of the United States. William Meese III was Attorney General of the United States. And Bill Mott, they brought him back out of retirement. He was the head of the National Park Service. Okay? So it was a strange feeling again, like I say, when we walked into that room. Probably that tended to be the most, well, how would I describe it? Interesting discussion that we had about differences between the agencies really was the fire budgeting. And those who've been in the business realize that there's really strong contrasts in terms of fire budgeting. It's quite interesting. All interior actions and the way the Park Service and the MPS interpreted it at this time was that all actions were after the fact appropriations from Congress. They didn't distinguish between a prescribed natural fire that was allowed to burn or fighting a wildfire in Yellowstone National Park, because they figured with the same pockets paying for it. In contrast to that, the Forest Service, even though it was probably the same budget, really had a different view of that. The Forest Service said, no, budgeted dollars will pay for prescribed natural fire, because we had a definition of prescribed fire, including prescribed natural fire as well as manager-ignited fires. And that had to be paid for by your budget, because it was your management that you're carrying out your management. That's why you had to pay for it in a separate line than this after-the-fact appropriation fighting those wildfires. And just so I won't hide anything here, now we've come all the way around and the Forest Service stuff has kind of gone away. Everybody does manage those fires, more like the National Park did in 1988. When I say that about the budgeting, because there had to be budgeted dollars used in the Forest Service, you know, you have to realize that in 1988, we also, in this region, had the Canyon Creek fire, you know, that went from roughly 55,000 acres to 287,000 acres in 40 hours, okay? Pretty good fire. And believe it or not, when you look at the records, the Forest Service, to manage that prescribed natural fire, only had $15,000. Okay? Officially, they only had $15,000. And what they did is, and what was really remarkable is that I think everybody here realizes that, fortunately for us, big fire seasons in the Northern Rockies are not repetitive, high frequency. They happen infrequently. And the Forest Service, unfortunately, had no way to roll that money over. So if you're going to lose it or use it, in some years you're going to lose it, why put a whole lot of money into that program, if you follow me there? So they got the benefiting agencies or organizations, they got wildlife to kick in $5,000, wilderness management kicked in $5,000, and fire kicked in $5,000 because it was fuel management. Okay? That's how they got $15,000 to manage all the wilderness fires in this region. That's what they had. And again, more recently, we've changed that budgeting process so that the money can roll over because of that infrequency. For me, it was interesting in that in 1990, we had a big fire conference in Bozeman. And Jan van Wykendonk, my friend, you know, from grad school, was supposed to introduce me on as a speaker at that conference. And the first thing he said was, "Damn, Wacky screwed up." I was sure he screwed up. You know, that's my dad's name. My dad's fish market was called Wacky's Fish Market, just so you understand where that comes from. And so that's how he knew me, and he was very frustrated because he had seen me. I'm the only one that ever put it in writing that national park plans were not in accordance with national policy. Okay, they didn't follow either MPS 18 or the interior manual. And I said that in writing. And it kind of got him PO'd, okay? Because Jan was the first national park person to be on the teaching cadre for S590 at Marana, you know, the highest fire behavior course that we have in the whole business. And he was the first one from the Park Service to take part in that. And he was kind of upset that I had gone ahead and said, oh, Park Service plans didn't meet our national policy, okay? But I said it. And so because of who he was, he called in every fire management plan from the Park Service and went through them. And so when he got up to introduce me, he said, damn, he was right. He didn't want me to be right, but he had to say that. In fact, 16 of 32 fire management plans in the National Park Service in '88 that were prescribed natural fire programs, half of them had no written prescriptions. They're just like this, you know. How are we going to let this burn or not? Right? That's what we had. And later, other people have shared with me that, as he described it, another friend said, oh, we had bombs ready to go off all across the country, and Yellowstone went off first. Okay? That's kind of how he viewed that whole thing. But Jan was, at least I felt assured, you know, because Jan said it, half those plans were not in accordance with national policy, just like I put in press. We had other kinds of things that only professors, you know, I'm the professor looking in on this thing, and I remember a day when I was in Boise. We would have our national meetings in different places, and this is all following that initial meeting, and we're in Boise, the National Fire Center, and each of us kind of had a little cubby hole. We were working on our stuff about what we were writing because we'd been given different assignments, and Blaine Cornell, who was the supervisor of the Stanislaus and a member of the national team, came up to see me because he was concerned, and he threw the Yellowstone, the '84 Yellowstone plan on the table, and he looked at me and he said, Ron, how could someone who wrote this plan be so perceptive to actually describe what had just happened in '88? They'd written about that repeated fires, repeated fronts could give you all this fire everywhere in Lodgepole Pine in Yellowstone Park. And he said, how could someone be so perceptive to write that in this plan? And this plan has no prescriptions. You know what I mean? No analysis of the fire weather. How can they think that, how can they realize that that was really could happen and have no decision trees in the entire plan? You know, you'd have to ask yourself, how could someone be that perceptive? And finally, I looked at him and I said, don't you know? And I've been surprising these guys because I'm the professor. And he goes, he sat down and he said, tell me something I don't know. And of course, if you know anything about National Park Service fire management plans, many of them are written by contractors. Okay, they're written by contractors, not by, because they don't have the fire staff to do that stuff. And it was written, we knew it had been written by Steve Pine. Okay, a professor and some people, they know Steve Pine, a professor at Arizona State, actually a history professor at Arizona State, I'll put it that way. And you know, because when I saw the request for proposal come out, I thought, who would be crazy enough to try to run a fire management plan for Yellowstone? You know? Yeah. Anyway, and I explained to Blaine that if you asked Steve Pine for the plan, he would give you that same plan with all the decision trees he had created through hours and hours of fire management analysis of the National Fire Danger Rating System output. And the park had pulled them all out of the plan. Okay. That's really what it was. And that's why he was so startled. He says, tell me something I don't know. And I didn't know, okay, that Steve Pine had done a professional job, put them all in there, did the analysis, and the park removed them all. Okay. I could just share with you that Lorraine Nitzmeyer, the regional director of the Park Service, had that plan for 2 years, from 1986 to 1988, and she never signed it. Okay? Just to tell you that she realized that she shouldn't be signing that thing too, because it didn't meet either the Interior Manual or NPS 18. Okay. I'm going to say that with respect to, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. No one has a flashcard. I'm sorry. I like it from the beer or whatever. Wow. Wow. This is not good. What's that? I have 27 more years, that's right, that's what I'm saying. Oh, exactly. I don't know if I really want to talk about fire policy that much. I want to share some things with some faculty members, because we have some older and younger faculty members. In my career, because of the fire issues are so big, and because I was in Missoula, Montana, I gave testimony to the Congress 3 times on fire policy. And it was very interesting, because I got an experience that you just can't get any other way than doing that. And I'll share that with you really quickly, and we'll get out of here, okay? In 1997, I was asked to go by the American Forest and Paper Association to give testimony to the House Ag Committee, the full House Agriculture Committee, and talk about the state of our forests. You know, and a lot of the undergraduate students just smile, because they know when I get off on talking about the state of the forest, you know. But overcrowded, undernourished, riddled with insects and disease, kind of a deal. And what happened there, you know, so I said, sure, I'll do that. And of course, they, AF and PA paid for my weighing. Boy, that's pretty nice. And what happened is you had to do it in short notice. And I want to say to professors here, if you have to give testimony, whatever you do, do not say yes. When you're pretty flattered when you get the call. Don't say yes until you talk to this guy right here. Okay? You have to talk to your dean. And that's because Congress doesn't pay a nickel. Okay? Not a nickel. Not your motel, nothing. Okay? No plane flights. And the other part is, when you say yes, your written statement has to be delivered. What am I saying? 150 to 200 copies of your written statement have to be delivered to the clerk of the room you're going to speak in the day before you speak by 12 noon. So you have to FedEx it there. So you've got all those expenses plus writing what the heck you're going to say. Okay? So it's a real rush job. But that's how the game works. Okay? So don't, until you talk to your dean, don't say yes. Okay? I was very fortunate. Perry supported me. Although the AFPA was going to pay this time, the big key was that I was worried that I was going to be viewed as a hired gun, because I was going for the American Forest and Paper Association. Okay? And luckily, you know, Perry played on that stage. And I asked him that, and he looked at me and said, oh, those guys are straight shooters. You don't need to worry. And it was always sticking in my mind, because you know, I went to Berkeley. John Zanuska, the dean of the School of Forestry there, got lambasted one time because he did that same thing, got paid by not a straight shooter organization to go to give testimony to Congress. And boy, they just beat him about the head. Okay? And I happened to be in his graduate seminar when he came back, and he let us have it. He told us what was going on. So I was concerned. Perry assured me that they were straight shooters, and I went and did that. And it was funny, because it was such a short notice, the only way they could get me a ticket on the plane is to buy me a first-class ticket. I've never, ever flown first class, ever again or since, okay? And Guess who walked in right after I sat down? Where is he? I saw him in here. Irv Schuster. There he is, right there. And Irv Schuster, you know, Forest Service economist, next to us here. Irv Schuster comes in the plane and sees me sitting in a first-class seat.
And I went to the back, eh?
And he said, and Irv said, you know Irv, he's a hunting buddy of mine. Irv looked at me and he says, "Oh, Professor Wakimoto, I am going back in the plane with all the rest of the peons." Right out loud. And that's again why I've never flown. If you're going to, Missoula, Montana, you know half the plane, right? So I've never flown first class again because of the effect of Irv on it. Just so you know. Well, that was kind of interesting. And there are other things here about testimony that I learned on this deal. This is where you have a full house ag. You have a red light, a yellow light, and a green light because you have only 5 minutes. And that's about 2 double-spaced typewritten pages read. That's all you get. Okay. So we had a meeting, because it was AFPA sponsored, we had a meeting and I had dinner with the state forester in Missouri. Missouri, I gotta say it like Harold Biswell would say it, Missouri. He's a Missouri boy. And the state forester of Texas. And while we're eating dinner, the staffers came around and kept asking us, "Do you have your questions? Do you have your questions?" And I didn't know how the game was played. That's why I'm telling you. And the state foresters had these questions, and he handed it to the staffer, and the staffer went away. They came back. "Do you have any questions?" "No, I don't have any questions." "Oh, okay." So they left. And the way the game is played is that those questions are given to the representatives from your state who are on that committee, so they can be informed and they can look informed by asking you a very good question. And of course, you have a prepared statement to answer that question so you can fill the congressional record. That's how the game is played. And I had no clue. Okay? So once again, if you make a statement, write some good questions so you can hand it, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, to the staffer. And that's how the game's played. I saw it, I didn't realize it until the state forester of Missouri on another panel was being questioned. Okay? And he got up there, the state forester of Missouri, the state forester of Texas, and the state forester of California, because we're talking about fire here. Okay? And they got up there, and the fellow from Missouri went first, and just before he was starting to speak, the one representative on that committee from Missouri came running in the room. He was even from a different party, but he came running in the room because he had to support his state. Okay? You think about it, we have one in the whole House. What odds do we have that when you give testimony, that person's even going to be on the committee? Yeah, I thought that too, because we're from Montana. Okay, not very good. But anyway, that guy came running in, and immediately the state forester started doing his 5 minutes, got through that, and then of course the chair asked for questions. And immediately the representative from Missouri asked this question of the state forester. And the state forester was wonderful, because he knew he was on camera. And he paused and he said, "Sir, that is a wonderfully perceptive question. You must really understand the importance of this to our state." Okay? And then he filled the congressional record for 5 minutes, or 10, 15 minutes after this. Okay? That's how the game is played. So if you go and they ask you for questions, have the questions if you go and give testimony. I mean, it was a great learning experience to do that. The other thing, and I guess I'll finish here, along with that same testimony, the first panel was the U.S. Forest Service panel, okay? Led by state and private forestry, and there were 4 of them on this panel. So that's 4 times 5 is 20 minutes, right? Well, the chair, the person leading that from state and private, read, for 20 minutes, read a statement. Because the people, they're entering it right then, the stenographer's putting it in. and just read it straight through, 20 minutes, no pause, and you know, they just kept going through the 20 minutes, and it was perfectly timed and all that. And then the chair said, "Okay, I have a question for you," and of course he was kind of upset, because you have to understand that Clinton was in the White House, but the House was controlled by the Republicans. Okay, and so they controlled who the chair was, and the chair said, "You know, we just went through this fire season, and your budget asked for, I can't remember, 65 million, something like that. And we just spent almost $1 billion. That ain't even close. How much do you need?" I mean, he said it that way. How much do you need? Well, you know, that was kind of a tough question, and you saw all the Forest Service heads of the departments sitting there with their hands folded, with a purposeful stare at the table to make it clear to the chair. Jim's smiling here because he's seen it before, where they're not going to answer any question this guy asks them, any question, because it's not been approved by the Clinton White House. So what happened is they just sat there, and I thought, my gosh, if the agency folks in the trenches saw that, they'd wonder what was going on. Because finally he said, "Oh, you know, that's not a very good question. How about I phrase it this way? If you had more money," and we're the only ones that can give it to you, you know, we're the Congress. "If we had more money, what would your priorities be?" You know, and the state forester sitting back there with me, we're doing handstands. You know, "Oh, you ask me that, I'll tell you what I think." And they just sat there with their hands folded. And so it just happened that I flew back on Thursday, and on Saturday I was helping teach a new class of journalists a new group of journalists from the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources that are at Lubrecht. We were going to teach that class, and this was all created by one of the former deans of the journalism school. And oddly enough, I don't know as this fate, I ended up in Jack Ward Thomas's old pickup truck. Okay, and if you know Jack Ward Thomas, he'll tell you the story or two. But he was the chief of the Forest Service up to the year before. Okay, we hired him to be the Boone and Crockett endowed chair. And we're driving over to the cookhouse in his old pickup truck, and I told him what I saw, that these people had their hands folded like that. And he said to me, "Ron, in the Clinton White House, you can't give them a straight answer. You're not supposed to give a straight answer unless it's already been pre-approved." And then he looked at me and he thought a bit, and he says, "You know, I was chief of the Forest Service. So when they asked me a good question, I gave them the best professional answer I could. And that's why I'm sitting next to you in this truck right now." Well, thank you very much for all coming today.